say to Americans who are upset with you over the way you downplayed this crisis over the last couple of months? We have it very much under control in this country. The coronavirus is very much under control in the USA. It's going to disappear. It's like a miracle. It will disappear. March 4th, we have a very small number of people in this country infected. March 10th, we're prepared. We're doing a great job with it. It will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away. What do you say to Americans who believe that you got this wrong?
And I do want them to stay calm. And we are doing a great job. If you look at those individual statements, they're all true. Stay calm. It will go away. You know it is going away. And it will go away. And we're going to have a great victory.
Japanese American economist, theorist, political economist, Francis Fukuyama, in his book in the 90s, The End of History, he professed and predicted the collapse of the communist, Soviet Union and China, leading to the free market liberalism, and overstated the triumph of the West and free market economy. And since his book was published, there is more wars and trillions of dollars spent on armaments, and that prophecy really did not hold. And challenge of the free market and private enterprise reaction to a pandemic like that, it seems like the country that has more collective response, they came up ahead. We have here Professor Muqtedar Khan. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relationship at University of Delaware. He researched and teaches in Islam and good governance and international relationship. So you wrote, this pandemic, it's gonna challenge the two players that they're gonna be standing after all this is China and the United States. And you wrote, there are two different scenarios, and it depends on what is going to happen. Could you entertain and summarize that analysis for us?
Well, you had a very long preface to the question, so I just want to touch on the Francis Fukuyama reference. Francis Fukuyama essentially argued that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was no major significant civilizational challenge to the West, and the West had essentially won. What he was trying to say that he was using the Hegelian notion of progress of history as essentially clash of ideas, and now that there was no serious ideational challenge to the West. And by that he meant to the notion of the liberal democracy. So the liberal democracy had now defeated communism, and therefore this was the model that everybody in the world would pursue. But to some extent, his prediction was valid for about a decade and a half, till around 2006, where we saw continuous progress. There were more and more countries becoming democratic. And not only that, but the countries which were already democratic were becoming more democratic. However, since 2006 onwards, we have seen a steady decline in democracy, which people like Larry Diamond and Francis Fukuyama himself refer to as the retreat of democracy. So now there are fewer democracies in the world than there were in 2006. Not only that, even those established democracies are not democracies at all. So, for example, the United States now is considered as a struggling democracy rather than a full-fledged democracy. So having said that, in my article, the point that I was trying to make is that this particular pandemic that we are experiencing right now, the coronavirus pandemic, it is not like any other crisis that we have experienced. This is the third crisis we have had in this century. It started with 9/11 in 2001, then the Great Recession of 2008-9, and now we have the coronavirus pandemic. I think this pandemic, and lots of analysts and thinkers are also making the case that it could have such profound changes on the world that the world will not remain the same as it was before the pandemic. One of the potential consequences of this could be, you see, the pandemic could affect different countries in different ways. And if it affects some countries more than others, then what it will achieve is alter the balance of power between those two countries. And therefore, the world afterwards will be different because the balance of power would have been altered. So what I do in this article, I wrote it for the Center for Global Policy. So I argue that there are clearly two potential scenarios that can emerge from the pandemic. One is that China recovers much quicker than the United States. And we can see that China is, at least if you believe the data that is coming out of China, the curve in China has flattened considerably. China has had only 5 deaths today and only some 60, 70 new cases, whereas the United States is having the worst day today of the pandemic. We have already had over 650 deaths today. We had 550 yesterday. And the total number of cases have, I think, crossed 200,000. So right now we are suffering the curve at its worst, whereas China has nearly flattened. So if China comes out better off at the end of the pandemic, then the current gap between the United States and China will decrease significantly. However, if the United States comes out better after 4 or 5 months, then the gap between the US and China could become significantly greater. So my argument in those two scenarios are recommendations for the United States grand strategy, that if the United States comes out worse off, what it should do vis-a-vis China, and if it comes off with an advantage, then how it should take advantage of this historical given opportunity to the US. So those are the two scenarios that I articulate in that article.
You talked about, we know with Trump, and I think since Reagan, we were going to that direction of neoliberalism, and now Trump, America first. And I think somebody wrote that one of the reasons our response was delayed and inadequate is because we felt we are culturally superior over this yellow people virus, and Trump has been calling it Chinese virus, and his Secretary of State. And
see, there are several things. One of the reasons why Trump is on few occasions has referred to this as the China virus is because one of the Chinese ministers started this rumor or this false allegation that the United States Army was responsible for triggering the coronavirus crisis in China, implying that this is an act of bioterrorism by the United States, etc. So these kind of rumors could really spread rapidly. So I think Trump was responding to that by essentially saying, no, this pandemic originated in China. And I think at that time, the New York Times also did an extensive article plotting the origins of the virus straight to the Wuhan province in China. And the whole point was to make sure that people don't forget that it originated in China, and this is not something that the United States has unleashed. I think the United States government, there has been a decline in the quality of government in the United States. We live in an era of extremely high partisanship, and the two parties hate each other. There is very little common right now within them. And so every opportunity that the two parties get to undermine the other is exploited at the expense of the national interest. So, for example, if you look at the media today, any day, whether you look at CNN or MSNBC, they seem to be covering Donald Trump's negative things more often than they actually provide coverage of coronavirus. So you would think that Donald Trump is the big news. Even today, if you were to watch CNN or MSNBC or NBC, even the articles that are published in Washington Post and New York Times are constantly saying, oh, he lied, he lied, he lied. Well, they have been saying this for the last 3.5 years. Everybody who doesn't like Trump knows what we need to know about Trump. I wish more attention was being paid to things surrounding coronavirus. For example, we are going to experience a very significant economic recession, even if we come out of the coronavirus crisis very soon. And that is what I'm referring to in my first scenario in the article, that if the United States goes through this forecast, for example, the economists at Goldman Sachs have predicted that the US economy will shrink by 25% in the second quarter, and then it will subsequently shrink by 10%. So if we have 2 quarters, we already are at around 6% negative growth for this quarter. So if we have 2 quarters in the negative growth, we would be in recession. And if we continue like that into the third quarter, then unemployment could reach 20%, 17 to 20%. And that high level of unemployment will be like the Depression era unemployment. And that is really going to be very difficult for the US government and the US economy to recover rapidly. It might take us several years to come out of that kind of recession. It took the Great Recession of 2009. By the time we came out, the entire 2 terms of Obama were over before we fully came out in 2014, around that time. So if it takes another 5 years for the US to recover from this economy, it would be drastic. So rather than focusing on what we should be doing right now to prepare ourselves, to prepare our citizens, to prepare our economy, to focus on this, we are focusing on, oh, Trump said this, or Trump said that, and Trump did this, and Trump did that. And I think that is an indication of why we were not good at responding. So, for example, yes, South Korea and the United States basically started at the same time. The coronavirus hit South Korea roughly at the same time as it hit the United States in January. But our media was not focused on the coronavirus. It was not just Donald Trump. The media was focused on Donald Trump, and they were focused on all the shenanigans that were going on with him and the election. And if you remember, Pete Buttigieg pulled out of the primaries in March. We are just still in March. So the whole country was still not focused on that. And it's not just Trump. Many leaders have been slow to respond to this. Look at the state of Florida. It was still having its spring break just 2 weeks ago. So I think there is a cultural problem in dealing with it. And there is also distrust of government, there's distrust of media. So even if the media were alerting the people that, look, we have a disaster coming, please act upon it, people would not be willing to act. Even now, we have a situation where people are not fully adhering to the social distancing protocols, etc. So I think this country did not take it seriously. And partly it could be from this idea that we are a technological and economically more developed country, and viruses and epidemics like this may undermine third world countries and not us. I think that could have played a role, but I think the biggest error is that the government did not anticipate this. And let me also tell you, if you remember the 2 senators who sold off their stocks once they were warned by the intelligence. So the intelligence was warning the U.S. government very early on, even before February, that this was going to be a very serious challenge. It was sufficiently serious for those senators to sell their stocks. Why didn't they alert the public?
Well, I mean, the extent of what actually happened and the implication and the facts will take years to figure out what's going on. You alluded to that. But it will take years to figure out what happened to make sure that what you wrote in your piece. No, should we use more of our soft power? Should we use more of our hard power? And you talked about that. So how do we act if we don't know exactly what happened?
See, right now, with each passing day, one of the things that is clearly apparent is that the United States is not leading the world against this pandemic. That was not the case in 2014, I think, when we had the previous pandemic, and Obama was all over. He was leading the world. Experts from the United States were going to the other countries to help them, right? We were just sitting and watching while this was happening in China, and there was no attempt by the U.S. government to go out there and get a hold on it. So what essentially happened in the last 2-3 months, if you notice, is nobody is looking up to the United States to lead the challenge to coronavirus. In fact, people are looking at us sympathetically and saying, oh, if we have a few ventilators left, we may send you. If you notice, Turkey sent 500,000 test kits and linked it to the media that Turkey had sent. So countries are helping us rather than we helping them. Plus, right now, there is no global response to coronavirus crisis. I mean, the only initiatives that are coming are from the World Health Organization. And the US has already abdicated its global leadership. And what Trump is not realizing is that we are losing a lot of our soft power right now. The less the world looks to us to solve this crisis, the more independent it becomes of the United States and the lesser United States soft power. Stephen Wall, the professor from Harvard, wrote an interesting piece saying one of the sources of United States soft power is its perception of its competence. That we are a competent country, we can solve these problems. And so when countries get into trouble, they look up to the US and say, please send us experts, please send us technology, please send us resources to fight these problems, right? Now nobody's doing that. And so one of the casualties of the coronavirus crisis or the pandemic would be that this perception that America is a competent nation may be lost forever. Plus, look at the case of Italy. Italy is the worst center. It is a country which is suffering 1,000 deaths per day for several days now. It has lost, I think, more than 11,000 lives, and it's completely devastated. Are we helping Turkey? No. Is Turkey looking up to us? No. Turkish philosophers are writing letters to us telling us how we can learn from their experience, but they're not looking to us. But it's China which is helping Turkey now. It's China which is sending equipment and resources, etc., to Turkey, to Italy, to help Italy recover from this crisis. So already you can see that during this crisis, China is already partly usurping the role that the United States used to play as a global leader. So at the end of this pandemic, if we are really damaged significantly, in the sense our economy is hurt so much that we are unable to do things for 3 or 4 years, then we will be forced to go into what is called as a mode in which we are retrenching. It's called a retrenchment, which means we will disengage from much of the world, and so we will not be policing the globe, leaving regional powers to exercise more influence in their neighborhoods. So that would be catastrophic for United States preeminence worldwide. And so that is my first case scenario, that we come out worse and China becomes a dominant player in the world. And what the US will then need to do is essentially try to strengthen itself. Instead of trying to build nations in other parts of the world, we should reinvest. I mean, if Trump had done what he said he would do, that is rebuild America's infrastructure. Remember all the promises of building the infrastructure? I see nothing. All he's doing is building a wall in the South. That is all. So really build. America needs to be rebuilt. There are lots and lots of drawbacks. We are falling behind in various technologies. We are falling behind in green technology. We are falling behind in 5G technology. We are falling behind in healthcare. There are other countries which are probably moving faster than we are in terms of finding a cure and a vaccine to this pandemic. So in healthcare industry, we do not have the best healthcare system. We are one of the unhealthiest countries in the world. So we are falling back on many areas, and it's time for the United States to take a deep breath, look at self in the mirror. The reflection is quite ugly. And it's like, I look in the mirror and I see a fat, middle-aged, bald man, and it's time for me to go and hit the gym and start working out and try to become healthy, become fitter, read more, improve yourself. So I think the United States need to invest in itself significantly to try to ensure that whatever little advantage it may have on China economically and otherwise, it is able to at least preserve that. The other scenario is that China could be lying about all of these things, right? And that the pandemic could be far more serious. China's economy, for the first time since 1976, is going to have a negative growth. Regardless of what happens from now on till December, China's economy is going to shrink. And China is an export-dependent, still an export-dependent economy, even though its domestic consumption has increased a lot. China will suffer if the rest of the world suffers, especially the United States. If Americans stop shopping, the other economies in the world, the Japanese, the Germans, and the Chinese are going to suffer. Who's going to buy stuff in Walmart? What will happen to China? Who's going to buy BMWs? What will happen to Germany? Who's going to buy the Hondas? What will happen to Japan? Right. So if the U.S. economy suffers, it's the U.S. consumption which drives the global demand and global growth, and so all the export-dependent economies will suffer. That's one thing. The second thing is, if the U.S. is forced to retrench, then most of these other countries will have to spend a lot more on their own defense and security. And as a result of that, they may not be able to progress and grow. So the U.S. is, historically speaking, we have a huge advantage over the rest of the countries in the world. We are not going to fall behind China. The gap will decrease. And so China's influence and China's ability to replace the U.S. will become far more credible if the U.S. continues to abdicate its leadership. However, if we come out reasonably well, so for example, if we are able to flatten the curve in April or by end of April or May, and we are out of the overwhelming shadow of the pandemic, say by June, July at the most, then the things that we have done economically, like the stimulus package for $2 trillion, we have increased liquidity in the marketplace. There are $4 trillion worth of cash available out there. There has been a recognition that America needs to shore up its manufacturing base again. So some of these things might really kickstart the U.S. economy in such a way that you may see that we might take off. So the U.S. economy was doing very well. Unemployment was still at 3.5% when this thing started. So we may really do far better, and the gap between the U.S. and China could increase significantly. And at that point, that's where my article comes in. The U.S. needs to ensure that the concessions that we have been making to China, we do not make. So, for example, since the 1980s, Henry Kissinger had made this statement saying, if you treat China as an enemy, China will become an enemy. So don't treat China as an enemy. And the United States since then has been trying to accommodate and include China in the global system. And so we made lots of concessions to China, looked the other way on its human rights record, on its violation of many intellectual property rights issues. We also look the other way with their human rights violations. We also look the other way at their environmental degradation that China has done. And we let them grow in the hope that China will be integrated into the global system and will become a responsible power and a friendly one. And I'm skeptical of that. I'm sure that China will become a great power. It already is a great power. But I'm not very sure that it's going to become a friendly power to the US like Japan or Germany. And so China is a counter-hegemonic player. Not only does China seek to alter the global system, but it also seeks to reverse what Francis Fukuyama said, which is replace the model of the best form of government from a liberal democracy to an authoritarian capitalist state. So countries will want to become like China, which means government-driven economic policies and less democracy, less human rights, less freedom of speech, etc. So if you can look at China, China is like a huge Singapore, economically successful, aggressive capitalist, but an authoritarian state. So both China as well as Singapore will become the models that people would want to emulate and copy, and not the United States. So the world will not be a liberal democratic dream of Francis Fukuyama, but a nightmare.
That's including Trump himself. He's fond of those dictators.
Trump, I don't think thinks. I think in Trump's world, 90% of the space is occupied by Donald Trump. The rest of the world has 10%. So he doesn't think about where the world will be, where America will be or should be or anything like that. He just worries about where he would be. And I think his biggest problem now is the fact that America allows people to be president for only 2 terms. Mm-hmm. If you remember, a couple of years ago, there was lots of news as to how Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese state, had consolidated power and basically had become the head of China for the rest of his life.
And CC and
yeah. So Trump actually expressed admiration and said, why can't we do that here? So he wants to be president for life. He would love to be emperor of North America. But he doesn't fully understand what his implications will be to civil rights and etc. I mean, America.
I never really believed that actually Trump knows what's going on or actually running the show. It seems like the clown that is elected a clown to run the circus, but now nobody's laughing. And who is behind Trump? I mean,
country is running on autopilot. There is nobody there. So, for example, you could look back at the time of Nixon and say, okay, when Nixon is busy with his stuff, it was Henry Kissinger who was probably running the country. And it is quite possible during the time of George W. Bush, we thought that Dick Cheney was the most powerful vice president we ever had in history, right? I don't think Mike Pence is running the country. I don't think anybody is, and that is the scary part right now, is that there is a curve coming across, and if the car is on autopilot and if Trump is not paying attention, we are just going to get off the road. And that is the biggest fear. I think on issues that Trump notices, he's in charge. And on issues that he doesn't care or does not recognize as they're part of his domain, the bureaucracies are running those issues. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I wrote an article advising governments of other countries how to respond to the United States. And I said that, look, on issues that Trump notices, follow his tweets. Unfortunately, you have to look at what he's tweeting to get a sense of what Trump is trying to achieve. But if Trump doesn't care about your country or doesn't even know that you exist, then deal with the embassies and the bureaucracy of the State Department. But Trump has also done something which is extremely detrimental to the country, which is he has reduced the capacity of the American state to do things. This whole talk of the fact that we have a deep state and it is anti-America, his attack on America's intelligence agencies, for example. So he has decapacitated the state itself. So, for example, Obama had built a very good pandemic response team when he left. And one of the things that Trump did was to depopulate that response team. So the very people who would have been in charge of dealing with the pandemic are not there, right? So that is one of the problems. So maybe we might build a new agency, like after 9/11, we created Department of Homeland Security. If we had created that before, then it is quite possible we might have preempted what happened on 9/11. So now, post-coronavirus crisis, we might create another agency of government whose very job is to anticipate, prepare, and then deal with pandemics. I think we are going to witness more and more of such pandemics and much more frequently. See, for example, even you deploying the Defense Production Act. Why did it take him so long? He was waiting for the private sector to respond and was hoping that some of his friends would start these companies and make those ventilators and make profit. I find it quite ridiculous. He should have triggered that in January after seeing what was happening in China. And if we had some left, we could have exported them to other countries, made money, made influence, given it away free, rebuild our soft power. Right now, we are going around trying to shop. The scene is so bad, apparently, that state governments are competing with each other and outbidding each other to acquire PPE and other medical supplies. And they're also competing with the federal government. And so it is like a crazy scenario, really, right now.
Well, Dr. Khan, thank you so much. You always enlightening us. Dr. Khan is a professor of in the Department of Political Science and International Relationship at the University of Delaware. Enjoy the rest of the day and stay home and stay healthy. And we'll be talking. This is not going to go away anytime soon.
No, it's not. Thank you very much. And I send the same message to your listeners to stay safe and stay at home.
Thank you so much.